Most of us grew up imagining castles the way fairy tales showed them. Stone walls glowing under the sun, cozy great halls, roaring fireplaces, nobles wrapped in fur enjoying feasts by warm candlelight. But historical reality is so brutal, it shatters that entire fantasy in seconds. Because if you ever stepped into a real medieval castle, the first thing you'd feel wouldn't be grandeur. It would be a blade-sharp cold, the kind that cuts through cloth, through skin, and sinks straight into your bones. Those fairy tale palaces romanticized by movies were, in truth, closer to frozen stone prisons than noble residences. Walls several meters thick didn't keep warmth in, they acted like giant slabs of ice sucking every bit of heat out of the room. Windows were narrow, like arrow slits, blocking light but funneling in cold drafts. And the wind from spiral staircases, tight corridors, and arrow loops combined into a cold-blowing machine that never stopped running, day or night. What people feared most back then wasn't war or enemy armies, it was the winter inside their own castle. From a distance, we see castles as majestic. But for the medieval people living inside, every day was a battle against the cold, a battle no one ever truly won. And that's only the surface. The real story behind why castles were so cold they practically tortured their own residents is even more shocking. If you think those meter-thick stone walls kept a medieval castle warm, that's one of the most dangerous misconceptions about medieval architecture. Because in reality, every part of a castle, the walls, the windows, the staircases, was designed for war, not for the comfort of the people living inside. Stone is an incredible
What is
defensive
it?
material, but
What
it's
have
the
you
worst
seen?
enemy of warmth. It absorbs cold from the outside like a sponge, and then releases it into the rooms all winter long. Those 3-5 meter thick walls we assume were insulating were actually gigantic blocks of ice pressed right against the backs of the people who lived there. And the windows, even worse. They were just wide enough to shoot arrows through, not wide enough to bring in sunlight. Each narrow slit acted like a natural wind tunnel, pulling icy air straight into the room. Then there were the spiral staircases and narrow passageways built to slow invading soldiers, yet they turned into vertical chimneys that sucked every bit of warm air upward. The moment a fire finally warmed your feet, an invisible current stole the heat away and dragged it straight up to the tower. In other words, the entire structure of a medieval castle functioned like a massive cold-producing machine, and the people living inside had no way to shut it off. That was the architectural tragedy no one ever expects. And here's a truth most of us would never imagine. Medieval people never tried to make their castles warm. Not because they lacked the skill, but because, in their minds, cold wasn't something you fought. It was simply part of life, as natural as sunrise or the changing seasons. And this is exactly the kind of detail that gives modern people culture shock when they uncover the real history. Today, whenever temperatures drop to around 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, people immediately complain about the cold. But for medieval people, winter inside a castle hovered near freezing, and they accepted it with a calmness that feels almost unbelievable to us. A 7-year-old child back then had a higher tolerance for cold than most adults today who have lived their entire lives in air-conditioned rooms. It wasn't that they were stronger, it was that they were trained from birth. Born in the cold, raised in the cold, sleeping in the cold, eating in the cold. They didn't try to heat the whole room because that was impossible. Instead, they learned to heat their bodies. Layers
me
of
about the
wool,
prisoners.
fur cloaks, hoods tight around the neck, hands wrapped in animal skin, even shoes stuffed with straw for
in here, I
insulation.
know it.
They never imagined a warm room, only a warm enough body to survive. And here comes the biggest twist. To them, cold wasn't the enemy, it was the teacher. A harsh teacher, yes, but one that made entire communities tougher, more united, and more disciplined. The cold created a world where people depended on each other to survive. If you lived in that era, do you think you could adapt? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to know. When people look at old paintings, many assume the tapestries hanging on castle walls were simply luxurious decorations, symbols of noble wealth and power. But the truth hidden behind those colorful designs is completely different. They weren't art, they were survival weapons. Stone walls, several meters thick, acted like giant slabs of ice, pulling in the cold from outside and breathing it back into the room all winter long. No one could sleep next to a wall like that without shaking uncontrollably. And that's where tapestries hand-woven from wool and silk became one of the most miraculous tools of the medieval world. They weren't just beautiful, they were the room's thermal lungs. When a tapestry was hung, a thin pocket of still air formed between the cold stone and the thick fabric. That tiny layer, which sounds insignificant, could raise the room temperature by several degrees. In a castle where the cold was constantly below human tolerance, those few degrees meant the difference between bearable and unlivable. Tapestries didn't just block cold, they also stopped drafts, reduced echo in great halls, and made vast stone chambers feel less gloomy. Poorer castles that couldn't afford grand tapestries used burlap, animal hides, or even woven straw mats, anything that could create that precious insulating air pocket. And perhaps the most surprising part, a single large tapestry could cost as much as an entire manor estate. They didn't just keep bodies warm, they kept their owner's reputation warm too. Without tapestries, just how unbearable would the cold inside a medieval castle have been? If you've always believed medieval people wore a simple tunic like in the movies, the truth will shock you. Inside castles that hovered near freezing, clothing wasn't fashion, it was survival armor, engineered with a level of precision surprisingly close to modern thermal technology. The first layer was always linen, a fabric that seems light, yet absorbs moisture so well that it kept the body dry even in cold, damp weather. On top of the linen came multiple layers of wool, a miracle material that retains heat even when wet, something no modern fabric does quite as well. Each added layer created another pocket of warm air, turning the body into a walking heater. The nobility added fur coats on top, both a symbol of rank and the strongest heat barrier of the time. Hands were wrapped in leather gloves lined with fur. The head and neck were always covered by a hood. Even the shoes were surprisingly complex. They were stuffed with dry straw to create insulation under the feet, a detail movies almost always ignore. The most surprising part? Despite wearing so many layers, medieval people didn't consider it a lot. To them, it was simply the only way to stay alive until spring returned. In a world where cold winds slipped through every crack in the stone, clothing was the last boundary between life and death. Miss even one layer, and the body might not withstand the castle's merciless chill. At the center of every medieval castle, there was always a burning heart, the Great Hall fire. From a distance, it looked like a symbol of warmth and power. But up close, you'd see the truth. It wasn't a sign of comfort, it was evidence of a desperate battle against the cold. That fire burned day and night, devouring logs like a hungry beast. But no matter how big it was, its warmth only reached a small circle around it. Take just a few steps back, and the heat vanished as if it had never existed. Those near the flames felt their skin burn, while anyone standing slightly off to the side shivered as if they were outside in the snow. Heat and cold existed side by side, creating a scene that felt almost surreal. Smoke rose through the hole in the roof, but the moment the wind shifted, the entire Great Hall turned into a smoky cave. Many people developed respiratory problems from breathing that ash-filled air, yet they endured it, because the only alternative was freezing to death. Few people know this. Where a person sat around the fire revealed their rank. The castle's lord sat closest in the warmest spot. Servants stood at the outer edge, where the cold bit hardest. The hearth didn't just provide heat, it exposed the social order, as if the light itself were dividing the classes. To medieval people, the hearth wasn't just for cooking or warmth. It was the soul of the castle, a sacred place, never extinguished without a serious reason. What about you? If you had to live in that great hall, would you take the heat near the fire or accept the cold at the edge? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. When people left the Great Hall, the only place with a large fire, they walked into a harsh truth. Most private rooms couldn't have a fireplace in the middle of the floor. Too flammable, too smoky, too cramped. So how did they survive in rooms that froze overnight, where your breath turned to mist in the darkness? The answer was a creation both simple and dangerous. The brazier, a portable charcoal burner that saved countless lives and quietly ended many others. A brazier looked harmless, just a metal or ceramic bowl on tall legs. Inside were glowing coals taken from the hearth. As the charcoal burned, it produced no flames, only a slow, steady heat that wrapped the room in a gentle warmth. To people back then, the brazier was a heat oasis in a sea of cold, the only thing that let them read, write, or sleep without their hands turning numb. But beneath that calm warmth lurked an invisible threat: carbon monoxide. No smell, no color, no warning. A closed room, a windless night, and many never woke up the next morning. That's why braziers were always kept away from beds, curtains, and wooden furniture. Servants had to change the
Okay,
coals
I have it.
constantly and open the door for
Are you sure you
ventilation,
want to go
even
through
though
with
that
this?
meant letting the
Yes, I
cold
am.
rush in. A brazier wasn't a heater, it was a survival gamble. One small mistake could cost a life. But in castles where the cold was relentless, people simply had no better choice. In a castle that felt like an ice cave, where stone walls breathed cold through the night, it wasn't the Great Hall, and it wasn't the brazier. The canopy bed was the final secret fortress of human survival. And this truth shocks many people today. A medieval bed wasn't just a bed, it was a tiny heated room built inside a freezing chamber. Four sturdy wooden posts held up a small canopy. Thick curtains of wool, velvet, or fur fell from every side, sealing off the world outside. When the curtains closed, the bed became a heat-trapping box where body warmth didn't escape, it gathered, rising degree by degree. Beneath was an insulating layer of straw. On top of that, a feather mattress. Above it, layers of wool blankets, fur coverings, and even small charcoal-filled warming pans tucked under the covers. Within minutes, the space inside transformed into a warm oasis, even when, outside the curtains, the water in the wash basin was turning to ice. And the most surprising part? Many people didn't sleep alone. They slept together to share heat, children, relatives, even honored guests. Not because there weren't enough beds, but because it was the only way to survive. In an entire sprawling castle, that small enclosed bed was the only place where a person could truly feel the warmth of life. In a place where stone was colder than steel, where your breath turned to mist in seconds, medieval people discovered a weapon no enemy could steal: warmth from
I used
within.
to hunt these
And the way
lions.
they achieved it wasn't just clever,
Now I
it
just feel
displayed
hunted.
power more subtly than any ceremony. In the Great Hall, amid smoke and the whistle of wind slipping through arrow slits, thick steaming soups and giant cauldrons of simmering meat were brought out like a performance. For castle residents, this wasn't just dinner, it was a survival ritual. A bowl of hot pea soup, a fatty slice of pork, a loaf of bread warmed by the hearth, that was the fuel their bodies needed to generate heat. But don't misunderstand, even food showed rank. The wealthy drank wine heated with cinnamon, pepper, cloves, spices as expensive as gold. Just one steaming cup of spiced wine said loudly and clearly, "I have the wealth to fight winter, a winter others must surrender to." Today we call it mulled wine. Back then, it was a declaration of power. Even drinking water wasn't safe like it is now. No one dared drink cold water in a stone room. They drank warm water from the kitchen cauldrons, or hot ale. Anyone who drank cold water was practically signing their own sickness warrant. Now imagine this scene: a packed great hall, hundreds of bodies radiating heat, firelight gleaming off steamy bowls of soup and ruby red cups of wine. Together, they formed a grand display of warmth in the middle of a merciless winter. So the question is, if you lived in that castle, what would you choose to stay warm? Food, hot wine, or power? If I told you that the real source of warmth in a medieval castle didn't come from fire or food or clothing, but from the way the castle itself was built, would you believe it? This is the silent secret almost no one notices. Medieval architects, though they knew nothing about modern physics, possessed an instinctive genius for controlling light and wind. They always chose to build castles on south-facing slopes where sunlight lasted all day and the harsh northern winds were naturally blocked. The most important rooms, like the Lord's bedchamber or the reception hall, were placed directly toward the sun, so even the weakest winter rays could warm the stone walls. During the day, the walls absorbed heat. At night, they released it like
Look
a
at the
medieval
map.
version of a solar
There is
battery.
no easy
The
route
coldest,
left to us.
darkest,
We
dampest
fight
areas,
here,
grain
or we
stores,
surrender the
armories,
capital.
narrow stairwells were pushed to the northern side, sacrificing their comfort to protect the rooms where life truly happened. It was a kind of politics of space, where you lived and which direction your room faced reflected your real status inside the castle. Floors were covered with thick layers of passion, straw, acting as natural insulation. Not only did straw block the cold, it absorbed moisture, reduced smells, and turned icy stone rooms into spaces where people could stand without trembling. All of this sunlight, wind direction, straw, tapestries formed an incredibly advanced passive heating system centuries before humans understood the science of thermodynamics. Looking back, medieval people didn't survive by luck. They survived through quiet intelligence, passed down through generations like a form of folk science. If you enjoy stories that uncover the hidden truths behind familiar history, leave your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the mysterious world of the past.